Hey, Bremen First United Methodist. I hope you are staying warm this morning. You know, it's not often in Georgia that we wake up to a third morning where we see snow on the ground. Stay safe, stay warm, and it'll all be thawing out soon, so enjoy it while you have it. This morning, we're going to be continuing our series on the Beatitudes, looking at some of these paradoxical statements that we see in the text that seem not to make sense. Last week, we talked about Jesus saying, "Blessed are those who are poor in spirit." And how can that be good? How can it be good to have not enough of something or to have limited resources in something that you might need, like a spiritual strength? But we discovered that when Jesus says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit," it's not that they have less. It's that they understand their limitations. And in understanding the limitations, they then understand their need for God. And then understanding their need for God, they know where to go to the source to receive what they need. So they are blessed because in their understanding of their own limited nature and their own spiritual poverty, they turn to God for strength, who is abundant and gives them what they need. So they are blessed by understanding their own poverty. Today, we're going to look at another statement that also seems to be a little bit strange. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are those who mourn. That's from Matthew 5:4. Blessed are they who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Short, small verse that also leaves us with something that sounds, once again, strange. Mourning, grieving, that's not something that we consider to be a blessing or to be enjoyable or something that we celebrate and seek out in our lives. So how does this statement of being blessed in mourning truly become a blessing in our lives? Well, let's get into it. You see, in our world as it is right now, with social media and influencers and advertisers, there is a push for us to only see the good and the positive, and to gloss over and to minimize and to hide anything that might be painful, negative, or difficult. It's this idea that we only look at those things that are good and ignore any evidence to the contrary that things aren't just as they should be. And if we do that, we can find some way to be happy in life. But the truth is, we know when we look around at our world, and I'm thinking today it's not very hard. If your news has been like mine, you see the destruction in Los Angeles. We reports still of wars and battles and unrest in Ukraine. We know of those who have even suffered just recently with the storms here, that when we have cold, when we have bad weather, that can be something that causes pain and hurt in people's lives. That it doesn't take us much time to look at our own lives, at the lives of people that we're connected to, or just lives of the people who live in this world, and see that there are things that are broken, that are not right, things that are causing hurt and pain and loss. And when we begin to look at the world around us with an honest view, which is what the Bible calls us to do, to take account, to look seriously, to judge rightly, to discern well. So the Bible is calling us to be clear-eyed and to be honest at what we're seeing, not to ignore and look over things. So if we are truly looking with eyes that see, it doesn't take us much time at all to see that those who are hurting and mourning and who are in pain and loss. So when we begin to see the world as it is, we begin then to see where the world is hurting and mourning. And that hurting and mourning is not something that was unfamiliar to Jesus. Jesus was someone who in his own life and ministry was no stranger to mourning and grief. Remember, he was moved. He was impacted by the pain and the needs of the crowds. When he saw them in their need, he was moved, and that moving led him to action. But at first he felt their pain. He felt their hurt. Jesus at the tomb of his friend Lazarus, he weeps. He weeps, he mourns, he cries because his friend has died and because of the pain of Lazarus' sisters who are mourning the loss of their brother. And then Jesus also, before his own arrest and trial, cries out, mourns, is in agony over about what is going to happen to him. He is experiencing grief and pain and hurt. One of the prophets said that Jesus, the Messiah, would be a man of sorrow. When we begin to experience and process and see and acknowledge the brokenness in our own lives, in the world around us, and what's happening with others, when we begin to mourn the state of the world, the state of our own sinfulness, or the fact of our own loss, when we mourn, we begin to more closely model and exhibit the life and the ministry of Jesus, who was one who also mourned. When we allow ourselves to grieve and mourn, we begin to show the world a more accurate picture of who Jesus was in his own life and ministry. When we begin to walk with those who are mourning in their own grief, we are more like the life and ministry of Jesus. You see, the blessing of mourning is not that we have grief, but the blessing of mourning is that in our own grief and mourning, we find a closeness to God that's promised in the scriptures. Now, Matthew says that blessed are they who mourn, for they will be comforted. But Psalm 34:18 says that blessed are those who mourn because they will be met, that God is going to be close to them. In fact, it says just this, Psalm 34:18, the Lord is near the brokenhearted. He saves those crushed in spirit. The blessing of beginning to mourn is that in the midst of mourning, we find God present in that grief. We find that we're not alone. And we also, in Jesus, find one who understands what it means to have sorrow and grief and pain. That we find a closeness to God in our pain that we might not find in other places. And that mourning and grief can become an avenue for God to work in our lives in a way that would not be possible otherwise. Someone said to me that people might be attracted to our strengths. When we look at those around us, people we might want to model ourselves after, we usually look for those who are the best or the greatest or do something well. We look at those strengths and we idolize them and say, that's something I want to be like. So people might be attracted to our strengths, the things that we do well. But people will connect to us through our weaknesses. They'll actually relate to us on a deeper level when they see us not as perfect, not as superhuman, but when they see us as someone like them who deals with grief and loss like they do, who is imperfect like they are, they begin to connect to us in a real and deeper way. In fact, the way I wrote it was this, is our mourning, going into a process of mourning, acknowledging the hurt in our own lives and in the world around us, that our mourning can actually let other people know that it's okay to mourn as well. Can let people know that it's okay to grieve as well. It can give permission for everything to not be perfect. We don't have to only focus on the strengths, the things that we do well, the things that are going great. We don't have to just be a continuous highlight reel of success. That when we mourn, it can allow other people to know that it's okay to mourn. that it's okay to not be okay, that it's okay for everything to not be as it should in your life right now. And then in connecting with them through grief and mourning, we might then be able to point them to the one, to Jesus, who is the hope, who will meet us and them and bring us through that mourning, through that night of weeping and crying, into the joy of a new dawn and a new day. Entering into mourning is a process that leads us eventually to the joy of the Lord that is promised to us. God said he's going to comfort those who mourn. He's near the brokenhearted, that mourning, weeping may last through the night, but joy comes in the morning. That process of mourning brings us through that hurt and that pain and that loss. And then by God's grace brings us to a place of healing and joy and restoration. As we allow ourselves to mourn, we allow ourselves to be more connected to God, who is doing that work in our lives. As we allow ourselves to mourn, we allow other people to see that it's okay for them to not be okay, and that we can point them to God, which brings glory to God and brings us all hope as we wait for God to wipe those tears from our eye and make all things right and new. So this morning, as you were listening to this message, I want you to know that it's okay for things not to be okay. I want you to know that if you are in a place of grief and mourning, God is there present with you right now. And I also want you to know that grief lasts for a season, but God's joy is promised forever. And God will be faithful to get you there and not leave you in this place forever. And that is why blessed are they who mourn.